Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
Always. What are we tackling today?
Well, today we're going to try to wrap our heads around a very difficult topic.
Oh.
Yeah, it's enforced disappearances in Pakistan.
Oh, wow. That's a tough one.
Yeah, and to be honest, I'm a little nervous to even touch this one.
I get that.
It's a topic that's just so politically charged, it's difficult to even know where to begin.
You're not wrong. It can feel like you're walking through a minefield sometimes with this topic.
Right.
But that's exactly why we have this giant stack of sources in front of us.
Yeah, that's true. We always try to cover all sides.
Yeah.
So what have we got today?
Let's see. We've got government commission websites, reports from international organizations,
Right.
like the International Commission on Missing Persons, the ICMP,
Okay.
and we even found some stuff on the FBI's missing persons list.
Wow, so it's international.
It is. And we've also got news articles from Pakistani sources.
Why?
Dawn.com is a good one.
Oh, yeah, I've seen that one before. They're pretty reliable.
And just to round things out, we've got a few Wikipedia entries to help give us some context.
So we're really trying to get the whole picture here, not just one perspective.
Exactly.
All right, so we're trying to understand what all these sources can tell us about how this whole thing works, right?
Yeah,
Are there patterns we can see across all these different sources?
that's what we're here to find out.
And probably the most important thing, what are the human stories behind all the numbers in official reports?
That's what we really need to focus on. And it's really important to be super clear about what we're talking about.
What do you mean?
Well, when we say enforced disappearances,
Yeah,
this isn't just like a general term for people going missing.
I see.
This is a very specific type of human rights violation.
Okay.
It's when people are taken away, usually by the government,
Right.
or by groups who are secretly working with the government's approval.
So they just disappear.
And there's absolutely no record of it.
Like no trial, no nothing.
Nothing. And no information is given to the family or anyone,
So it's like they were just erased.
basically.
God, it's chilling. You know, one thing I noticed in some of these sources that really stuck with me is how they use terms like missing persons,
Yeah,
as if it's just like a normal thing, like someone just wandered off and got lost.
right.
But that feels like they're trying to hide how awful this really
Yeah.
is.
It absolutely is an attempt to just downplay how serious it is.
Right.
And you actually see this same tension, between acknowledging the issue but also trying to minimize it in some of the Pakistani sources too.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So for example, Dawn.com mentions this government minister who was saying that they had actually found and reunited 2,200 missing people with their families.
Oh, well, that's a lot of people.
And just in Balochistan.
Okay.
But then, literally in the same breath, they say that there are still 468 people missing from that same province.
Oh, so they're trying to have it both ways.
It really comes across like they're trying to say, see, we're doing a good job.
But the numbers don't really back that up.
The numbers tell a very different story.
And speaking of numbers, one statistic really hit me hard. It was from Amina Masood Janjua.
Who's that?
She's this human rights activist in Pakistan, and she said there are over 5,000 reported cases of enforced disappearances.
Wow.
But I was thinking, if you consider all the pressure on families to stay silent and not make waves,
Yeah.
that number has got to be way higher than 5,000.
Right. You're absolutely right. These disappearances are happening in an environment of intense fear. So when you see a number like 5,000 cases, it's probably just the tip of a much larger and much darker iceberg.
So how far back does this problem go in Pakistan? Is this something new, or has it been happening for a long time?
Well, when you look through all these different sources, it seems like General Pervez Musharraf's rule.
When was that?
That was from 1999 to 2008. That
Oh.
was a real turning point.
Why?
The war on terror, especially right after the U.S. invaded Afghanistan in 2001, really ramped up paranoia and suspicion inside Pakistan.
It's mentioned in a lot of these sources that people were suspected of being terrorists, and they just vanished.
Right.
Sometimes allegedly handed over to the U.S., even ending up in Guantanamo Bay.
It was a really dark period in Pakistan's history.
And very much tied up with everything that was going on globally after 9/11.
Absolutely. And the most disturbing part is that it didn't start with Musharraf.
You mean the disappearances?
Yeah.
Yeah.
They may have become a lot more common under his rule, but they've continued under every single government since.
So this isn't just about one bad guy or one political party.
No, it seems like it's built into the system somehow.
And when you talk about enforced disappearances in Pakistan, you can't really ignore what's happening in Balochistan, can you?
You're right. It's a really key part of this whole story.
It seems like that's where the situation is the absolute worst.
Yeah, Balochistan has always been a hotbed for these separatist movements.
Which are?
These are groups who want to break away from Pakistan and form their own country. There's been a really long-running conflict there, and it seems like that's just fueling the disappearances.
Hmm.
The Wikipedia entry actually says that in October 2024, there were, on average, 3 disappearances reported every single day in Balochistan.
Wait, hold on. 3 per day.
That's what it says.
That's horrifying.
It really is, and it just shows how incredibly volatile the situation in Balochistan is. The insurgency there seems to be a breeding ground for these disappearances.
Right.
But the sources also paint this really confusing picture of who is actually to blame.
What do you mean?
You have security officials who claim that the numbers are totally exaggerated.
Okay.
They blame the disappearances on the insurgents.
Okay, so they say it's not them.
Or they even say that these people are migrating or they've run away.
Oh, so just making excuses.
But then you also have claims that the separatist groups are carrying out disappearances too.
So it could be either side.
And sometimes they even dress up as the military.
To make it look like the army did it.
Exactly. It's really difficult to figure out what's really happening.
It sounds like it's almost impossible to know the truth with everyone pointing fingers at each other.
Yeah.
But it's important to remember, behind every single one of these disappearances, there's a real person with a family who has absolutely no idea what happened to them.
That's exactly right. And some of the sources do actually give us little glimpse into these individual stories.
Oh, really?
There's this list of, and it's scary to even read, people who have at any point gone missing.
Oh, wow.
And it just hits you that these aren't just statistics.
Yeah.
These are sons and daughters and parents, people whose lives have just been completely ripped apart.
The Wikipedia entry mentions this young journalist,
Oh, yeah?
Zinat Shahzadi.
I think I've heard that name.
She was actually investigating disappearances.
And then what happened?
And then she disappeared herself.
Oh, my God.
I know, it's hard to even wrap your head around that.
That's crazy.
And to make it even worse, her younger brother couldn't handle the uncertainty, and he ended up taking his own life.
Oh, my God, that's awful.
She was later found, but it just goes to show you how these disappearances completely destroy families,
Yeah.
even if the person comes back.
It's just devastating.
And then there's the case of those 5 social media activists who vanished in 2017.
What happened to them?
Well, they reappeared eventually,
Oh, okay, so at least there's that.
but their families said they wouldn't talk about what happened.
So they were probably threatened.
And that lingering fear that something terrible happened to them, that must be incredibly difficult to live with.
It's like they were silenced somehow.
So we've seen how this impacts people's lives, but what about the government? Are they doing anything to investigate these disappearances?
Yeah, are they trying to hold anyone accountable?
Well, according to the sources, there's this Commission of Inquiry on Enforced Disappearances.
Okay.
It was actually set up in 2011.
What prompted that?
It was on orders from the Supreme Court.
So they're taking it seriously, at least.
Well, their website says that they've received over 7,000 cases and that they've managed to resolve about 5,000 of them.
5,000? That seems like a lot. But I wonder, is it actually working?
That's a good question. What do other sources say about how effective this commission actually is?
That's where things get a little bit complicated.
What do you mean?
Human rights groups, even some media outlets like Dawn.com, have expressed serious concerns about whether the commission is actually effective.
So they're saying it's not really working.
There's a sense that the investigations are incredibly slow. They're not very transparent.
So they don't tell the public what they're actually doing.
And on top of that, it's very rare that anyone actually faces any consequences.
So it's there, but maybe it's not really doing what it was set up to do.
It's like they're going through the motions, but not really delivering justice.
That's what you're getting at.
Yeah, and this lack of accountability was really highlighted back in 2021.
What happened?
The Islamabad High Court.
That's like the Supreme Court, right?
Yeah, it's a very powerful court in Pakistan.
Okay.
And they actually made a landmark ruling.
What did they say?
They held the prime minister and the entire cabinet responsible for the government's failure to protect people from these disappearances.
Wow, to actually have a court say that the top leaders are responsible for this, that's not something you see every day.
It was a big deal.
But did it actually change anything?
That's the question.
Did it lead to more accountability?
Did the number of disappearances go down?
Those are really important questions.
We need to keep those in mind as we look at all this.
And there's also that new law.
You mean the one that was passed in November 2020?
Yeah, the one that makes enforced disappearance an actual crime.
Right, with a 10-year prison sentence.
Which sounds like a step in the right direction.
It does.
At least they're finally admitting how serious this is.
It is a big step just having a specific law to address this.
But like you said before with the commission, just because there's a law on the books doesn't mean it's going to be used.
Exactly. The real test is, will we see people actually getting arrested and charged under this law?
Will it make a real difference?
I guess only time will tell.
It just feels like there's this pattern.
What do you mean?
They pass these laws, they set up these commissions, but things just seem to keep on going the way they always have.
It's like there's this disconnect between what they say and what they actually do.
So to really understand why these disappearances keep happening, we need to look deeper.
I think so.
What are like the underlying causes?
Right. Are there systemic issues that are allowing this to continue?
That ruling from the Islamabad High Court, it just really stuck with me
Me too.
because it really points to something bigger than just a few bad apples making bad decisions.
It really does.
Right.
Yeah, that ruling was a serious indictment of the entire system.
Okay.
It suggests that these disappearances aren't just like random events.
Like one-offs.
Yeah, they're a symptom of a much deeper problem with how power works in Pakistan.
Especially when it comes to the security forces.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
help me understand this. What are these deeper problems?
Well, one factor that comes up over and over again in all these sources is this lack of civilian control over the military and intelligence agencies.
Right. Historically, the military has been incredibly powerful in Pakistan.
And they've often operated with a lot of autonomy.
Yeah, it's like they have their own set of rules.
And how does that connect to the disappearances?
Well, think about it this way. If you have these really powerful groups that aren't really answerable to anyone,
Okay.
it creates a situation where abuse can thrive
How so?
because there's no one to hold them accountable.
So no one can step in and say, you can't do that.
Exactly. And this lack of oversight can really embolden people
Who might think?
who might see disappearances as just like an easy way to maintain control or
Right.
to silence people that they see as their enemies.
So it's like a shadow government,
Yeah, operating in the dark.
and no one can touch them.
It's a scary thought.
It really is. And to make matters even worse, the justice system itself is often too weak or too intimidated to properly investigate these cases.
Let alone actually prosecute anyone.
That's what we saw with all the criticism of the Commission of Inquiry, right?
Exactly. They might have good intentions
But they just don't seem to have the power.
or the will to really get to the bottom of this.
So it's like this vicious cycle.
What do you mean?
Powerful groups do whatever they want. The courts can't or won't stop them, and the disappearances just continue.
It's a system that protects the abusers, not the victims.
And that sends a chilling message to everyone in society
What message?
that if you speak out, you might be next.
You're right. It creates this climate of fear where people are afraid to challenge those in power.
Okay, so that makes sense. The sources also talk a lot about the role of conflict and instability.
Right.
And we know that Balochistan, where most of these disappearances are happening, has been in a state of conflict for years now.
Decades, really.
So how does that play into all of this?
Well, conflict always creates a really dangerous environment for human rights.
What do you mean?
When a government is focused on fighting an insurgency, it can be really easy to throw things like due process and rule of law out the window.
So in the name of security, they justify these actions.
And the lines between legitimate security operations and enforced disappearances can become very blurred.
It's like a war mentality, but it's happening inside their own country.
Yeah, anyone can be seen as the enemy.
And suspicion and fear just become the norm.
And that's where those conflicting narratives that we talked about earlier come in.
About who's really to blame.
Exactly. In Balochistan, you have the government blaming everything on the insurgents.
But you also have accusations that the separatists are doing it too.
It's a very messy situation.
It makes it incredibly difficult to know who's telling the truth.
It's like a perfect storm for abuse.
What do you mean?
You have this climate of fear, a lack of oversight, and a conflict where the truth is always the first casualty.
And we can't forget that it's not just about fighting insurgents, right?
No.
We've seen cases of journalists, activists, bloggers, anyone who criticizes the government seems to be at risk.
You're right, these enforced disappearances aren't just about crushing armed rebellion. They're a way to silence any kind of dissent.
So they just want to control the narrative, crush any opposition.
Exactly. In the case of Zinat Shahzadi, that journalist who disappeared while she was investigating disappearances.
Yeah.
That's a perfect example.
It's like they're sending a message.
What message?
If you try to expose us, this is what will happen to you.
That it's a very chilling warning to anyone who might dare to speak out.
So we've got a system where no one's held accountable, a constant state of conflict, and this deliberate attempt to silence anyone who disagrees with the government.
It's a toxic mix.
And it's the perfect environment for this kind of abuse to thrive.
But we also can't forget the real human cost here.
Right. What about the families, the people who are left behind?
What happens to them?
The trauma of enforced disappearance, it doesn't stop with the person who's taken.
You're right, their families are plunged into this living hell,
Not knowing if their loved one is alive or dead.
if they'll ever see them again.
And we see this so clearly in the stories that are shared by people like Amina Massoud-Janjua.
That activist you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, who's been fighting for years to find her husband.
He disappeared back in 2005, right?
Yeah, her story and the stories of countless others like her are just heartbreaking.
It's important to remember that these families are not just passive victims.
What do you mean?
They're actively seeking justice. They're demanding answers. They're holding the state accountable.
In what ways?
They're organizing protests. They're filing petitions. They're working with international groups
So they're doing everything they can.
to keep their loved one's memory alive and to try to uncover the truth.
It's amazing to see their strength in the face of such unimaginable loss.
It really is.
But it also makes you wonder what can be done to help them.
Right. Is there any hope for justice and accountability in a system like this?
That's the question, isn't it?
And I think the answer involves both internal reforms within Pakistan and pressure from the outside world.
Okay, so let's start with what needs to change inside Pakistan itself.
Okay.
Where do we even begin?
Well, I think the sources actually offer some ideas.
Really?
Yeah. For example, Human Rights Watch.
Yeah.
They have a whole report on enforced disappearances in Pakistan.
Okay.
And they actually lay out some pretty specific recommendations.
Oh, interesting. So let's hear it. What do they suggest?
Well, one of their big things was to actually make enforced disappearances a specific crime in Pakistan.
Which, to their credit, they actually did.
They did back in 2021, but Human Rights Watch also makes it very clear that just having a law isn't enough.
Yeah, a law doesn't mean anything if it's not actually enforced.
Exactly. They really emphasize that it needs to be enforced.
And that perpetrators need to be held accountable.
Exactly, but that's going to be tough given everything we've talked about.
Right, with the military and the intelligence agencies basically operating outside the law.
It's a huge challenge.
So what do they suggest? How can that be addressed?
Well, they call for a truly independent body to investigate these disappearances.
So not like the current Commission of Inquiry.
They argue that the commission, while it's a good first step, it just doesn't have the power
Or the freedom.
to really do its job effectively.
So they need something with more teeth.
Exactly. Something that can actually stand up to the powerful groups that might be involved.
I see. So a truly independent body. What else?
They also urge Pakistan to sign on to the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance.
What's that?
It's a global treaty. And they say if Pakistan were to ratify it, it would send a really strong message that they're committed to tackling this problem.
And that they're aligning their laws with international standards.
Exactly.
That makes a lot of sense. Are there any other concrete ideas out there?
Yeah, the ICMP, the International Commission on Missing Persons,
Okay.
they focus on the need to improve Pakistan's DNA database.
Oh, yeah. Forensics.
And their forensic capabilities in general.
So being able to actually identify remains and giving families some kind of closure.
Which is so important.
It is. Are there any other recommendations?
They also talk about the need for better cooperation between government agencies and civil society groups.
So breaking down those walls, sharing information.
Yeah, because it's such a complex problem, it requires everyone working together to find solutions.
Right. And we can't forget about the families who are going through this nightmare.
Of course not.
What can be done to support them?
These families need real practical help. They need access to lawyers,
Okay.
counseling, financial assistance, health care.
So it's about recognizing the immense trauma they've experienced and giving them the resources to cope and try to rebuild their lives.
I imagine just knowing that someone cares that they're not alone in this would make a huge difference.
It really would. And we can't underestimate the importance of giving these families a platform to share their stories.
To speak out.
These stories need to be heard. It's about breaking the silence.
And challenging that culture of impunity that surrounds these disappearances.
Okay, so we've got this roadmap.
Yeah.
Strengthening the law, creating a truly independent investigative body, signing international treaties, improving forensic science, and supporting the families.
Sounds good.
But let's be realistic for a second. There are going to be some serious roadblocks.
You think?
I do. What are the biggest challenges to actually making all of this happen?
Well, one of the biggest hurdles is going to be resistance from within the system itself,
Especially,
especially the security establishment.
as we've talked about, They've been using enforced disappearances as a tool for so long.
Yeah, and there's some very powerful people who benefit from keeping things the way they are,
So it's about taking on these really entrenched power structures.
challenging those who think they're above the law.
That's a pretty daunting task.
It is.
And then you've got the issue of political will.
Right, you need sustained commitment from the very top levels of government.
To really prioritize this issue.
But it's such a politically sensitive topic.
I can imagine.
A lot of politicians are probably afraid to really challenge the military and the intelligence agencies.
So it's about putting human rights ahead of political calculations.
Which doesn't always happen.
And of course, there's always the issue of resources.
Right.
All of this, strengthening the justice system, training people in forensic science, supporting the families, it all costs money.
And money is always in short supply.
Especially in a country like Pakistan that's facing so many other challenges.
It's a question of priorities.
Making sure this issue actually gets the attention and the funding that it deserves.
Exactly.
It all sounds so challenging.
It is.
Are there any reasons to be hopeful?
Do you think things can actually change?
I don't know. It's hard to say. What do you think?
I think there are some reasons to be hopeful.
Like what?
Well, the fact that enforced disappearances are now officially a crime in Pakistan.
Oh yeah, that is a big deal.
It's a huge step
It shows that at least people are paying attention.
that the pressure is building,
And what about that ruling from the Islamabad High Court?
where they held the prime minister and the cabinet responsible.
Yeah.
That was massive.
It was.
It sent a really powerful message that no one, not even the top leaders, are above the law.
Those are definitely some positive signs.
They are.
Maybe, just maybe, the tide is starting to turn.
I hope so.
And we can't forget the incredible work that's being done by all the human rights activists on the ground in Pakistan.
Absolutely. People like Amina Masood Janjua, who we talked about earlier.
She and so many others are literally putting their lives on the line.
To fight for justice.
Their courage and dedication are really inspiring.
They're the ones who give me hope.
And we shouldn't underestimate the role of the international community either.
You're right. Human rights groups, the UN, foreign governments,
They can all keep the pressure on Pakistan
to make sure that these changes aren't just temporary.
to actually create some lasting reforms.
Exactly.
So we've got some legal progress, the
Well-
courts are stepping up,
Hmm.
activists are fighting for change, and the world is watching.
Yeah. It's a small glimmer of light in a very dark situation.
It is. So as we wrap up this deep dive into such a complex and disturbing topic,
Uh-huh.
what's the one thing you really want our listeners to take away from this conversation?
I think the fight against enforced disappearances in Pakistan is ultimately a fight for justice
For accountability.
and for a society that truly values human rights and the rule of law.
It's a fight that requires everyone to participate.
The government, the courts, civil society, and the international community all need to work together.
And it's a fight that we all have a role to play in.
We can all do something.
Well said. This has been a really heavy topic.
It has.
But it's so important to shine a light on these injustices.
It is.
And while it's easy to feel overwhelmed by all of this, I think, as you said, change is possible.
It is.
Starts with awareness
understanding the complexities.
and in recognizing that we can all do something, no matter how small, to make a difference.
Exactly.
So to our listeners, we urge you to stay engaged, to learn more, to support the organizations that are working on this issue, and to use your voice to advocate for justice and accountability. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.